Welcome to our channel, where we bring timeless Bible stories to life. Stories of faith, courage, and divine intervention that resonate with us even today. If you love exploring the richness of God's Word, you're in the right place. Don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible Bible stories. And if you feel inspired, leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this powerful story. Today, we dive into one of the most suspenseful and faith-filled accounts in the Bible, the binding of Isaac, also known as the thicket, found in Genesis 22. This story takes us into the heart of Abraham, a man whose faith was tested in the most unimaginable way. Imagine this: God, who had promised Abraham that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars, Genesis 15 verse 5, asks him to sacrifice his beloved son, Isaac, the very child through whom the promise was to be fulfilled. It's a command that defies logic, challenges love, and stretches faith to its breaking point. In this gripping narrative, we witness Abraham's unwavering obedience, Isaac's trust in his father, and God's ultimate provision, which reveals his character as Jehovah Jireh, the Lord will provide, Genesis 22 verse 14. But this story is more than just an ancient tale. It's a foreshadowing of a greater sacrifice, one that would come thousands of years later when God provided his own son, Jesus, as the ultimate offering for our sins, John 3 verse 16. As we journey through this story, we'll explore the intense emotions, suspenseful moments, and profound truths that continue to inspire and challenge us today. Abraham, now 120 years old, sat under the vast starry sky of Beersheba, his home in the southern desert of Canaan. The cool night breeze carried with it the familiar scent of dry earth and olive trees. Yet tonight, there was an unsettling stillness in the air. The patriarch, his long beard streaked with silver, looked up at the heavens, counting the stars as he often did, a habit born of God's promise, "So shall your offspring be." He thought of Isaac, his son, now a sturdy young man of 17. The boy was his pride and joy, the miraculous answer to decades of longing and despair. Isaac was the embodiment of God's covenant, a promise fulfilled in flesh and blood. For Sarah and Abraham, he was more than just a son. He was the future. As Abraham rested his tired body against the rough bark of an oak tree, his eyelids began to droop. Suddenly, a voice, deep, commanding, and unmistakably divine, pierced the silence. "Abraham!" The old man's eyes snapped open. He knew this voice. It had guided him out of Ur, promised him a son, and delivered him from countless dangers. "Here I am," he answered, his voice steady though his heart raced. "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." The words were like a dagger to his chest. For a moment, Abraham was frozen, his mind reeling. Sacrifice Isaac. His Isaac, the boy who carried the laughter of his wife Sarah in his smile, the boy who was the fulfillment of God's own covenant. How could God, the giver of life, demand such a thing? The stars above seemed to dim, and the silence around him grew oppressive. Abraham clutched his chest as if to hold back the pain. His hands trembled, but he did not argue. He had learned long ago that the ways of God were beyond human understanding. Yet this was incomprehensible. Abraham remained under the tree, his knees drawn to his chest, wrestling with the command until the first light of dawn crept over the horizon. His mind was a storm of questions, his heart a battlefield of anguish and faith. Would God truly take Isaac, the son he had miraculously given? Was this a test? And if it was, what would happen if he failed? Finally, as the morning sun painted the desert in shades of gold, Abraham rose to his feet, his decision made. His face was etched with lines of sorrow and resolve. "I will trust him," he whispered, though his voice cracked with emotion. Even in this. The next morning, the household stirred to life as usual, oblivious to the weight of Abraham's burden. Sarah busied herself with daily chores, and Isaac was helping the servants tend to the flocks. Abraham watched his family from a distance, his heart heavy with the secret he bore. He called for 2 of his servants and instructed them to prepare supplies for a journey. "We're going to the region of Moriah," he said curtly, avoiding their curious gazes. Then he approached Isaac. "My son," he said, his voice soft but strained, "come with me. We're going to offer a sacrifice to the Lord." Isaac's face lit up. He loved accompanying his father on these spiritual journeys, and the thought of worshiping together on a distant mountain filled him with excitement. "Of course, father. I'll prepare for the journey." As Isaac hurried off, Abraham turned to the pile of supplies. He lifted a knife, its blade glinting in the sunlight, and stared at it for a moment too long. His grip tightened until his knuckles turned white, but he forced himself to place it among the supplies. He then gathered wood for the burnt offering, each log feeling heavier than it should. Every step, every action, was an excruciating test of his resolve. The servants noticed their master's uncharacteristic silence, but they dared not question him. That night, Abraham lay awake, staring at the tent ceiling. Beside him, Sarah slept peacefully, unaware of the storm raging within her husband. He dared not tell her of God's command. How could he? How could she bear such news? When dawn broke, Abraham rose quietly and prepared the donkey. The journey to Mount Moriah had begun, and with it, the most harrowing test of faith he had ever faced. The rising sun cast long shadows over the desert as Abraham, Isaac, and 2 servants set off on their journey to Moriah. The air was crisp and silent, save for the steady clopping of the donkey's hooves and the occasional rustle of the wind over the dunes. Abraham led the group, his shoulders hunched as if carrying a weight far heavier than the supplies strapped to the donkey. Isaac walked beside him, his youthful energy contrasting with his father's somber demeanor. The servants whispered among themselves, puzzled by the subdued atmosphere. They had accompanied Abraham on countless journeys before, but this one felt different. The master, normally a fountain of wisdom and stories during their travels, was eerily silent. Isaac, ever curious, tried to lighten the mood. "Father," he began, "what do you think we'll see at Mount Moriah? Do you think we'll encounter wild animals?" Abraham glanced at his son, his heart aching at the boy's innocence. "Perhaps, my son," he replied, his voice strained, "but God will guide us." For 3 days, the group traveled through the wilderness. The landscape grew more desolate with each passing mile, the green pastures of Beersheba giving way to rocky terrain and barren hills. Abraham barely ate or slept, consumed by his thoughts. He replayed God's command in his mind over and over, searching for some clue, some explanation. He clung to one hope, God's promise. Had he not said that Isaac would be the one through whom Abraham's descendants would come? Was it possible that God would raise Isaac from the dead? Abraham didn't know how, but he resolved to trust. On the morning of the 3rd day, the terrain shifted. Sharp, jagged peaks loomed on the horizon, their silhouettes stark against the brightening sky. Abraham's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the shape of Mount Moriah. "There it is," he said softly, his voice breaking the silence. The servants followed his gaze and exchanged uncertain looks. Isaac, oblivious to the tension, smiled. "We're almost there. I'll help build the altar when we arrive." Abraham forced a nod, his lips pressed into a thin line. His mind was a cacophony of thoughts, fear, love, faith, all vying for dominance. When they reached the base of the mountain, Abraham turned to the servants. "Stay here with the donkey," he instructed, his voice firm. "The boy and I will go up to worship, and we will return to you." The servants hesitated, sensing something unsaid in their master's tone, but they obeyed. Abraham placed the wood for the offering on Isaac's shoulders, while he himself carried the fire and the knife. Isaac glanced at the items in his hands and then at his father. "Father," he asked, his voice tinged with curiosity, "we have the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham's heart clenched. He stopped walking, his eyes fixed on the ground. Then, summoning every ounce of faith, he looked at Isaac and said, "God will provide for himself the lamb, my son." Isaac nodded, satisfied with the answer, and they continued their ascent. Isaac, unaware of his father's torment, remained focused on their task. "We're almost there, Father," he said, smiling. Abraham forced a smile in return, though it was weak and fleeting. "Yes, my son, almost there." As they climbed higher, the air grew thinner and colder. The barren landscape around them seemed to echo Abraham's desolation. The summit loomed ahead, a jagged outcrop against the pale sky. "Father," Isaac called again, breaking the silence. "What kind of offering are we preparing? Will it be a lamb or a goat?" Abraham hesitated, his steps faltering. The truth sat like a stone in his throat, threatening to choke him. But he couldn't bring himself to tell Isaac, not yet. "God will provide, my son," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Isaac nodded, his faith in his father unshaken. He adjusted the wood on his shoulders and continued up the path. Abraham followed, each step heavier than the last. The summit was desolate, a windswept expanse of jagged rock and sparse vegetation. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground. Isaac dropped the wood near a flat patch of earth and began arranging the stones for the altar. Humming softly to himself, Abraham watched his son work, his heart breaking with each passing moment. He moved mechanically, gathering stones and stacking them to form the base of the altar. His hands trembled, but he forced himself to keep going. When the altar was complete, Isaac placed the wood on top, arranging it carefully for the fire. He looked around, scanning the barren terrain. "Still no lamb," he said, frowning slightly. "Do you think we'll find one here, Father?" Abraham couldn't meet his son's eyes. His lips moved soundlessly as he whispered a prayer, his soul crying out to God for strength. Isaac stepped closer, concern flickering in his eyes. "Father, are you all right?" Abraham placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his grip firm but trembling. "Isaac, my son," he began, his voice shaking. "The Lord has asked something of me, something I cannot explain." Isaac tilted his head, confusion clouding his face. "What do you mean?" Abraham took a deep breath, his chest tightening. "You are the offering, my son." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Isaac stepped back, his eyes wide with shock. "What? Father, no, that can't be. Why would God ask such a thing?" Abraham knelt before his son, his eyes filled with tears. "I do not understand it myself," he admitted. "But I trust him, Isaac. I trust him with everything, even you. God's promises are sure, even in this. We must obey." Isaac's breathing quickened, his mind racing, his youthful faith mirroring Abraham's. "If it is God's will," he whispered, "then I will obey." Crying out in anguish, "O God, my Lord, if there is any other way, show me. Spare my son." But no voice came, no intervention, only the howling wind and the silence of the heavens. Abraham reached for the knife, his hand shaking violently. He looked down at Isaac, whose eyes were wide with both fear and trust. "I love you, my son," he whispered. "May the Lord's will be done." The knife gleamed in the fading sunlight as Abraham raised it high. The air seemed to hold its breath, the moment stretched into eternity. Then, just as he began to bring the blade down, a voice thundered through the air. "Abraham! Abraham!" Abraham froze, his hand suspended in midair. His heart pounded as he turned his head toward the source of the voice. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," the voice commanded. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." Abraham's knees buckled, and he collapsed to the ground, the knife slipping from his grasp. Relief and awe surged through him as he looked to the sky. Abraham's breath came in short gasps as he knelt beside the altar. The voice of the angel still echoed in his ears, reverberating through his very soul. Slowly, he lowered his trembling hands, the knife slipping from his fingers and clattering onto the rocky ground. Isaac, still bound and lying on the altar, stared at his father, his chest rising and falling with rapid breaths. "Father," he whispered, his voice shaky, "is it over?" Before Abraham could respond, a rustling sound came from the nearby thicket. Both father and son turned their heads toward the noise. There, caught by its horns in the dense branches, was a ram, Its white coat gleamed in the sunlight, and it struggled feebly, unable to escape. Tears welled in Abraham's eyes as he looked to the heavens. "Jehovah Jireh," he murmured. "The Lord will provide." Abraham rushed to Isaac, his hands fumbling as he untied the cloth bindings. He pulled his son into a tight embrace, holding him as if to shield him. Abraham prepared the ram for the sacrifice. His hands moved with practiced precision, but his heart was filled with a newfound gratitude that made every motion sacred. The ram lay on the altar, its struggling replaced by a strange calm, as if it too understood its purpose. Abraham lifted his hands toward the sky, his voice breaking as he called out in prayer, "Lord, you are faithful. You have tested me, and I have obeyed, though the cost was great. Yet in your mercy, you provided for us. I offer this ram as a sacrifice of thanksgiving and praise. You are Jehovah Jireh, the Lord who provides." As he lit the wood, the flames crackled and rose, consuming the offering. The smoke curled upward, carrying the scent of burnt offering toward the heavens. Abraham and Isaac stood side by side, their faces illuminated by the fire, their hearts united in worship. For Isaac, the flames seemed to cleanse the fear and confusion that had gripped him. He looked at his father, his admiration deepened by what they had endured together. "God truly does provide," he said softly. The voice of the angel spoke again, ringing out with divine authority. "Abraham, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you. I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me." Abraham fell to his knees, overwhelmed by the weight of the promise. He bowed his head, his heart filled with awe. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered. "Your word is life, and your covenant is everlasting." Isaac knelt beside his father, his young face alight with wonder. He didn't fully understand the depth of the promise, but he felt its power. The fear and uncertainty of the past days faded, replaced by a profound sense of purpose. Together, they rose and began their descent from Mount Moriah. The journey back to Beersheba was quiet but not somber. The air around them felt lighter, filled with the invisible presence of divine assurance. The descent from Mount Moriah was filled with a quiet solemnity. Abraham and Isaac walked side by side, their footsteps crunching against the rocky path. Although the journey was the same as the climb, everything felt different now. The weight that had pressed so heavily on Abraham's shoulders had lifted, replaced by a deep sense of peace. Isaac's gaze often wandered to his father, searching his face for clues to the mystery of the experience they had just shared. "Father," he finally said, his voice breaking the silence, "was this test for you, or was it for me as well?" Abraham slowed his steps and looked at his son. The boy's face was pale but resolute, his youthful features marked by a newfound maturity. "It was for both of us, my son," Abraham replied. "The Lord tests his servants to reveal what lies in their hearts. I have learned to trust him fully, even when the path is dark. And you have shown great courage and faith." Isaac nodded, processing his father's words. But why would God ask for such a thing, only to stop it at the last moment? Abraham sighed deeply. "His ways are beyond our understanding, Isaac. But one thing is certain. He desires our trust, our obedience, and our love. Through this test, he has shown us that he is the provider, Jehovah Jireh, and he has renewed his promise that through you, all nations will be blessed." As they continued their journey, the tension between them eased. One of them said, bowing deeply, "Was the worship successful?" Abraham smiled faintly, his expression serene. "It was. The Lord is faithful." That night, as the camp settled into stillness, Abraham sat alone by the fire, staring into the flames. The stars above seemed brighter than ever, their light a reminder of God's promise. His thoughts wandered to the years he had waited for Isaac, the laughter that had filled the tent when Sarah bore him a son in her old age. And now this son, his miracle, his joy, had been the subject of the greatest test of his life. Abraham's heart swelled with gratitude. He whispered a prayer into the quiet night. "Lord, you have tested me and found me faithful. Yet it is I who am grateful for your mercy, for your provision, for your promises that never fail. May I walk all my days in your ways." The fire crackled softly, as if in response, and Abraham felt a profound sense of peace wash over him. While his father sat by the fire, Isaac lay awake in his tent, his mind swirling with thoughts. He replayed the events of the past days over and over, trying to make sense of them. The memory of the altar, the knife, and his father's trembling hands haunted him. Yet alongside the fear and confusion was a deep respect for his father's faith and an awe for the God they served.